The room froze as Alan Dershowitz leaned back in his chair, the smirk already forming before the words even left his lips. With the casual cruelty of someone long accustomed to power, he dropped his judgment like a gavel. Jasmine Crockett, he sneered, was unfit for court. The sentence echoed across the chamber, slicing through the air with the sharpness of a blade. Gasps erupted, not loud but heavy, a collective intake of breath, as if the walls themselves had been insulted. Eyes darted toward Crockett. Some widened with shock, others narrowed with disbelief, and yet the sharpest stares weren't at her at all. They were directed at him, the elder statesman of the law, a man who wore arrogance like a tailored suit, daring the world to challenge him. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't move. In that stillness was a different kind of power, one that seemed to unsettle those watching more than the insult itself. The silence stretched thick with tension, the way it does before lightning splits the sky. For a moment, it wasn't about politics, or law, or even the clash of two figures. It was about dignity under fire, and the audacity of a man who believed. His voice alone could strip it away, because this wasn't just about her. His words carried the weight of generations who had been told they were unworthy, unqualified, undeserving of a seat at the table. It was an attack, not on a single woman, but on everything she represented, the immigrants who built lives from nothing, the communities who fought for recognition, the young Americans who dared to believe their voices mattered. The insult was meant to diminish, to shrink her down to nothing more than a target for his scorn, but instead it lit a fire. The crowd felt it before anyone saw it, a shift in the atmosphere, a quiet storm building behind her eyes. Everyone leaned forward, phones tilted, recording. The moment was alive, electric, teetering between humiliation and history. And then, as if the nation itself were holding its breath, the question loomed. How would Jasmine Crockett answer the arrogance of Alan Dershowitz? But no one expected her response to flip the entire moment on its head. Asterisk, in the seconds after his words fell, the chamber became more than just a room. It was a battlefield of ideas, and everyone watching could feel it. This wasn't just Alan Dershowitz taking aim at Jasmine Crockett. It was an old order flexing its muscles against a rising tide. It no longer knew how to contain Dershowitz. Carried with him the weight of decades at the pinnacle of legal culture, Harvard classrooms, high-profile cases, and television interviews that turned his name into a brand of authority. He was the embodiment of what many called the establishment, polished, confident, dismissive of anyone who didn't mirror his pedigree. His declaration that Crockett was unfit for court wasn't merely an insult, it was a verdict, delivered from that establishment to a new generation daring to disrupt it. On the other side stood Crockett. She was not of the elite corridors he came from, nor did she pretend to be. She wore her roots as her armor, a daughter of grit, of service, of communities too often spoken for, but rarely spoken with. To her supporters, she wasn't just another representative. She was proof that dignity could rise from the very places power had long ignored. That's why the stakes were so high. This wasn't the clash of two personalities. It was a collision between two Americas. One America believed credibility was stamped by Ivy League credentials, by the endorsements of insiders, by connections that stretched back generations. Other America believed credibility was earned by sacrifice, by service, by the lived experiences of people who had been told no 1,000 times and still showed up anyway. And so, when Dershowitz declared her unfit, the words carried more than arrogance. They took the centuries-old tone of gatekeeping, the kind that had slammed doors on immigrants, on women, on communities of color, on anyone who dared to claim a voice in spaces guarded by men like him. To his defenders, it might have sounded like a sharp legal critique, but to millions of others, it sounded like history repeating itself. That's why the air in the chamber felt electric. It wasn't just what he said, it was what it symbolized. Viewers across the nation felt the ripple. Millions watching from their homes, their phones, their offices, sensed that they weren't just witnessing a spat. They were watching a test of who gets to speak with authority in America and who must forever prove their worth. Social media was already buzzing. Clips of the insult, barely seconds old, were being shared with captions of outrage and disbelief. People tweeted, "Did he really just say that?" Others commented, "This isn't about her, this is about all of us." The feeling spread. Quickly, something unforgettable was unfolding. No one wanted to look away. But here's the truth. Dershowitz's words would not have hit with such force if they had come from just anyone. His stature, his reputation, and his long shadow over American law gave them weight. They came not as a throwaway jab, but as a decree from a man who for decades had been considered untouchable. That's why the insult stung so sharply, and why Crockett's silence in that moment was louder than any immediate rebuttal could have been. The nation leaned in, waiting, bracing. Because to fully understand why that single insult carried so much poison, and why her response would soon have so much power, you need to know the man behind them. Alan Dershowitz was never just another lawyer. For decades, his name carried the aura of a legal titan, the kind of figure whose presence alone commanded attention in courtrooms, classrooms, and television studios. He had been the youngest tenured professor in Harvard Law School's history, a scholar celebrated for his sharp mind and relentless defense of constitutional rights. To his admirers, he was a gladiator for the First Amendment, a man who fought unpopular cases to preserve the principles of justice. But to his critics, and there were many, his brilliance had hardened into arrogance, his independence into a brand of self-righteous elitism that thrived on controversy. The contradictions were impossible to ignore. Dershowitz built his career on defending the defenseless, yet over time, he became most famous for defending the powerful men whose reputations were toxic, whose names drew headlines dripping with scandal. O.J. Simpson, Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump. To some, this showed his belief that everyone deserved representation. To others, it revealed a darker truth, that Dershowitz was drawn not to justice, but to the spectacle of power, to the spotlight that controversy guaranteed. His defenders called him fearless. His detractors called him shameless. And yet, what frustrated so many wasn't just who he chose to stand beside, it was how he carried himself while doing it. He spoke with the certainty of a man convinced that his intellect placed him above the crowd, dismissing challengers as if their arguments were mere distractions unworthy of his time. In interviews, his tone often dripped with condescension, a weary patience that suggested he was indulging his critics rather than engaging them. The more he spoke, the clearer the pattern became. Dershowitz didn't debate to discover truth. He debated to win. He leaned on his credentials like a shield, invoking Harvard decades of experience, and his long history of fame as if they alone proved him right. For those who watched closely, it was this reliance on prestige, more than his arguments, that revealed his deepest flaw. It wasn't just arrogance, it was entitlement, a belief that his past achievements granted him the permanent authority to decide who was credible and who was not, and that entitlement is what made his attack on Jasmine Crockett cut so deeply. When he labeled her unfit for court, it wasn't the remark of an ordinary critic. It was the pronouncement of someone who had spent a lifetime atop America's most exclusive institutions, now pointing down from his pedestal to dismiss a woman who embodied everything those institutions had long excluded. The controversies that surrounded him only sharpened the sting. His association with Jeffrey Epstein had cast a permanent shadow, raising questions about the choices he made. In pursuit of fame and power, his public defense of Trump during impeachment had drawn outrage from those who saw it as a betrayal of his supposed principles. Time and again, Dershowitz placed himself in the center of storms, seemingly drawn to the outrage as if it were fuel. And through it all, he never flinched, never admitted fault, never softened the air of superiority that made him both fascinating and infuriating. To those watching Crockett face his insult, these contradictions were impossible to ignore. Here was a man who had defended the rich and infamous, calling unfit a woman whose entire career was built on service, resilience, and speaking for those without privilege. The imbalance was stark. His words didn't just feel dismissive. They felt like an attempt to erase her, to declare that all her struggles, all her victories, all her credibility counted for nothing against the weight of his name. It was this clash of worlds that electrified the moment. Dershowitz's arrogance wasn't new. It was the familiar mask of a man who had spent a lifetime certain that his voice would always be the loudest in the room. But on that day, in that chamber, the mask was slipping. The audience didn't see a titan of law. They saw a man clinging to the authority of his past, hurling insults at someone whose very presence challenged his sense of superiority. Long before she ever stood in the chamber facing down Alan Dershowitz, Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to being underestimated. Her story didn't begin in the polished lecture halls of Harvard or under the glare of cable news lights. In communities that rarely make headlines, in neighborhoods where resilience wasn't an option but a necessity. From the very start, she carried with her not the privileges of pedigree, but the weight of responsibility to her family, to her community, to the ideals she believed America could still live up to. Crockett's path to public life was never smooth. She built her career as a civil rights and criminal defense attorney, often representing those who couldn't afford the kind of powerhouses that men like Dershowitz symbolized. Her work wasn't glamorous, but it was vital. She fought for people who had been ignored, dismissed, or silenced, immigrants facing deportation, young black men caught in a system designed to fail them, women pushed to the margins. For her, law was never just about statutes and precedent. It was about justice. It's about reminding those in power that the people they overlooked were still human beings whose dignity mattered. That conviction became the compass of her public service. She entered politics not out of ambition for titles, but from frustration at how often her clients' struggles were tied to decisions made far above their heads. Her first campaigns were uphill battles, underfunded, underestimated, written off by the same voices who would one day underestimate her in Congress. Yet she kept showing up, and the people she fought for kept showing up with her. Her victories weren't landslides of establishment endorsements. They were hard-earned through door-to-door conversations, late nights, and a refusal to quit even when the odds were stacked against her. By the time she entered Congress, Crockett had already carried years of scars and lessons that made her more prepared than her critics realized. She had stood in courtrooms where she was talked over, dismissed, even mocked for daring to challenge the system. She had weathered whispers that she wasn't polished enough, wasn't experienced enough, wasn't the right fit. And yet every time she turned those doubts into fuel. Every "you can't" became her reason to say, "Watch me." What set Crockett apart wasn't just her persistence, it was her integrity. In an era when so many voices in politics chase the spotlight or bend with the wind of public opinion, she stayed grounded in her principles. She spoke with a conviction that came not from theory, but from lived experience. When she talked about injustice, it wasn't abstract. It was the reality she had seen on her clients' faces, the pain she had absorbed in countless late-night phone calls from families who had nowhere else to turn. To her supporters, Crockett wasn't just another politician. She was a fighter for truth, for dignity, for the people too often excluded from the conversations that shaped their lives. She carried herself not with the arrogance of entitlement, but with the confidence of survival, the kind that can only come from having been underestimated again and again, and still finding a way to rise. And perhaps that is why her presence on the national stage mattered so deeply. She represented something larger than herself. For young women of color, for working-class families, for immigrants watching from the sidelines, she was proof that the doors long closed by elitism could be pushed open with grit and persistence. She didn't have to carry the trappings of the old guard to be credible. She had earned her credibility in the trenches. Her voice carried the resonance of authenticity. That day in the chamber, when Dershowitz leaned back in arrogance, he may have thought he was putting her in her place. But what he didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett's entire life had prepared her for moments exactly like this. Being underestimated wasn't new to her. It was the backdrop of her journey. Every dismissal, every raised eyebrow, every gate she was told she couldn't walk through had forged her into someone who no longer trembled in the face of arrogance. This wasn't her first time being underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last time she turned it around. She had carried her story into that chamber, not as baggage, but as armor. And with that armor, she was about to transform an insult meant to break her into a statement that would inspire millions. So when the insult came, she was more than ready. Allen. Dershowitz wasn't finished. His first insult had landed, but instead of letting it linger, he pressed forward, doubling down as though sheer repetition could turn his words into truth. He leaned back in his chair again, voice rising, his cadence carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to commanding a classroom, a courtroom, a stage. "Unfit," he repeated, rolling the word on his tongue as if savoring it. Unfit for the rigor of the law, unfit for the standards of real jurisprudence. Each word landed like a hammer, meant not just for Jasmine Crockett, but for anyone in earshot who dared to believe she belonged. The crowd shifted uneasily. What had begun as shock now edged into discomfort. Some whispered under their breath, unsure if they were witnessing a debate or a public undressing. A few leaned forward, shaking their heads in disbelief, while others glanced nervously at Crockett, as if waiting for her to break under the barrage. The murmurs swelled, a low current of tension that spread through the room like static. But she didn't break. She didn't even blink. Crockett sat steady, her hands folded, her expression calm, almost serene. To anyone watching closely, her composure was not passivity, it was patience. She understood something the room hadn't yet realized. Arrogance always peaks before it crumbles. Dershowitz, oblivious to the shifting energy, kept climbing higher. He invoked his decades at Harvard, his shelves of published books, his long line of courtroom triumphs. His voice swelled with the kind of authority that had silenced challengers for years. "I've seen the best legal minds of our time," he declared, "and this doesn't measure up." He gestured dismissively in her direction as if brushing away a fly. Some in the audience winced. The more he spoke, the more brittle his certainty became. It was the spectacle of power overselling itself, of entitlement trying to masquerade as truth. What was meant to humiliate her now began to expose him as condescension, his hunger to dominate, his reliance on credentials instead of character. Crockett, still silent, let him continue. Every word he spoke built the case against him. Brick by brick, she knew the power of timing. She had seen men like this before, men who believed the louder they spoke, the more right they were. She had learned that the most devastating answer wasn't always the fastest, but the one that arrived after arrogance had exhausted itself. The murmurs in the chamber grew louder. Phones tilted upward again, lenses capturing the unraveling scene. A few faces in the crowd betrayed something more than discomfort now, anticipation. They could sense it, the imbalance, the storm gathering behind her silence. Every second she didn't respond was its own kind of rebuttal, exposing the desperation in his need to be heard, his fear of losing control of the room. Finally, the rhythm shifted. Dershowitz's words began to slow, not because he was finished, because he was running out of new ways to frame the same dismissal. His arguments circled back on themselves, looping into repetition, clinging to his resume as if it were proof enough. He leaned harder into elitism, trying to smother her with the weight of his own name. But the harder he pushed, the clearer it became. The room was no longer with him. All eyes were on Crockett now. The murmurs hushed as people leaned in, waiting for her to speak, waiting for the moment they knew was coming. The tension in the air was a taut string, stretched to its limit. She took a slow breath, lifted her gaze, and in that instant the chamber seemed to pause. Silence was no longer his weapon. It was hers, until the silence broke and her clapback left the room stunned. The silence hung like a held breath, stretching second after second until even Dershowitz seemed to sense he had overplayed his hand. His smirk faltered just slightly as he glanced toward Jasmine Crockett, expecting either retreat or stammered defense. But Crockett did not move quickly. She allowed the weight of the room to lean toward her, allowed anticipation to build until the crowd itself seemed to demand her voice. And then she spoke. "Professor," she began, her voice calm but carrying the sharp edge of restrained fire. "You've made a career out of telling people who does and doesn't belong. You sit in judgment as though your resume grants you the power to define worth. But let me tell you something." She paused, letting the chamber absorb the gravity of her words. "Your judgment doesn't make me unfit. It makes you blind." "Duh!" Air cracked. Gasps rippled through the audience. For the first time, Dershowitz's composure wavered. He leaned back, blinking, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. But Crockett wasn't done. She had just begun. "You call me unfit because I don't look like you, because I don't sound like you, because I didn't climb through the same ivory towers you hold as gospel." Her voice gained strength with every sentence, her rhythm deliberate, her delivery punctuated by silences that landed like blows. "But unfit? Unfit is ignoring the people we serve while congratulating ourselves for how clever we sound in courtrooms. Unfit is believing power exists to protect the powerful instead of those who have been left behind. Unfit," she said, pointing her words like arrows, "is mistaking elitism for excellence." The murmurs in the chamber erupted again, some startled, some thrilled. Cameras zoomed in on her face, steady and unflinching, then cut to Dershowitz's tightened jaw, his once lofty arrogance now forced into a defensive stillness. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her tone lowering, commanding the room through quiet force. "I didn't come here to prove I could pass your test. I came here because real people, people without privilege, without protection, without a voice, are counting on me to fight for them. And I will not fail them just because you decided to play gatekeeper." The crowd stirred, applause beginning. In small bursts, quickly shushed by those desperate not to miss a word. The shift was unmistakable. Crockett was no longer simply defending herself. She was turning his insult into a mirror, showing everyone who he truly was. Dershowitz tried to interject, his hand twitching as though to wave her off, but she pressed on, her cadence unbroken. You've had decades to prove what the law means to you. For you, it's been prestige. For me, it's survival. For the communities I represent, it's the difference between being protected and being preyed upon. You want to talk about fitness? Let's talk about standing in the fire when every system is stacked against you. Let's talk about carrying generations of struggle on your shoulders while being told to sit down and wait your turn. Let's talk about how many times people like me were told we were unfit and how many times we proved them wrong. By now, the audience was hanging on every syllable. Some nodded vigorously, others mouthed silent wows, and a few, overcome, clapped despite the tension. Unable to restrain their support, Dershowitz's eyes darted around the room, searching for backup. But the faces staring back at him were no longer in his corner. They weren't watching him. They were watching her. And Crockett delivered the line that cut deepest. See, Professor, the truth you can't admit is this. The future of this country will not be defined by the old guard clinging to their pedestals. It will be defined by those who refuse to be dismissed, who refuse to be told they are unfit, when in fact they are the very heartbeat of America. You don't get to decide my fitness? The people do. And they've already decided I belong. The eruption was immediate. Applause thundered through the chamber, some rising to their feet despite attempts at decorum. Cheers mingled with shouts of affirmation. Gasps gave way to clapping, clapping gave way to cheers, and suddenly the chamber sounded less like a hearing, and more like a rally. Dershowitz, red creeping into his face, tried to regain his footing. This isn't about, he stammered, his voice fighting against the wall of applause. But his authority had cracked. The steady, unshakable professor was now visibly rattled, his words drowned out by the very crowd he once commanded. Crockett sat back, not triumphant in vanity, but resolute, her expression clear. She had not spoken for herself alone. She had spoken to every person ever been told they didn't belong in the room, and the room felt it. Goosebumps spread through the crowd, people whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. It was more than a rebuttal. It was a moment of reversal, a turning of the tide where truth stood taller than arrogance. The cameras caught everything, the widening eyes of the audience, the clenched jaw of Dershowitz, the calm strength of Crockett, as she let the echoes of her words settle over the room. For years, he had been the authority, the voice others deferred to. But in that instant, his voice was no longer the loudest. When the applause finally softened into silence, Crockett added one last piercing thought. Call me unfit all you want. Every time you do, you remind this nation exactly why voices like mine must rise louder. Because the future doesn't belong to the gatekeepers, it belongs to the builders. The crowd roared once more, a wave of affirmation crashing against the walls. Dershowitz shifted uncomfortably in his chair, adjusting his glasses, his face betraying the rare sting of defeat. And Jasmine Crockett, she didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to add another word. The mic drop had already landed, and its echo was still reverberating through the chamber. The battle in that room was over, but its reverberations were only beginning. What had been a single clash of words now carried the energy of something far greater, something that could not be contained to four walls or a single audience. Asterisk, because the battle didn't end in that room. It exploded across the nation. Asterisk, asterisk. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her clapback, the chamber itself was electrified. But what happened next, beyond those four walls, was even more explosive. Within minutes, clips of her rebuttal were uploaded to Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The algorithm did the rest. By the end of the night, hashtag Crockett Clapback was trending. In the US, soon joined by hashtag Dignity Wins, users posted side-by-side screenshots. Crockett steady, eyes burning with conviction. Dershowitz flustered, adjusting his glasses in visible discomfort. The contrast was irresistible, and the internet ran with it. One viral tweet summed up the sentiment. Dershowitz brought elitism to the fight. Crockett brought truth, and truth won. Memes flooded the timeline. TikToks replayed her mic drop. Line, the future doesn't belong to the gatekeepers, it belongs to the builders. Often slowed down, remixed, or set to dramatic background music. Reaction videos showed creators literally leaping from their chairs, shouting, "Say that again?" as Crockett's words landed. YouTube commentary channels, always quick to dissect moments of drama, released breakdowns with titles like Jasmine. Crockett just shut down Dershowitz on live TV, and the mic drop heard around the nation. Even late-night hosts clipped the exchange. their monologues filled with punchlines at Dershowitz's expense. And it wasn't just entertainers. Journalists picked up the story with urgency. Major outlets ran headlines like, "Crockett versus Dershowitz, a clash of generations. When experience meets integrity and loses the Congresswoman who refused to be dismissed," editorials praised her composure and conviction, noting how rare it was to see a politician turn an insult into a moral lesson. Commentators compared it to historic debate moments, the kind that defined reputations for decades. Celebrities chimed in too. Actors, athletes, and musicians tweeted their support. A Grammy-winning singer posted, "This is what leadership looks like. Crockett's voice is our voice." A well-known NBA star reshared the clip with the caption, "She crossed him up and left him on the floor." Even civil rights leaders added their voices, calling Crockett's words a continuation of a long tradition of refusing to bow to the gatekeepers of power. Meanwhile, Dershowitz wasn't so lucky. Became a meme in his own right, but not the kind anyone would want. TikToks dubbed his flustered expression with the caption, "When you realize your degrees don't protect you from the truth." On Reddit, threads roasted him with gifs of toppled statues and captions like "Elitism crumbles in real time." The generational divide became a flashpoint. For some, Dershowitz represented the old guard, brilliant perhaps, but insulated. Dismissive, blind to the lived realities of those outside his world. Crockett, by contrast, was framed as the future, unshaken, authentic, and unwilling to be talked down to. Cable news ran split-screen panels of the exchange, analysts debating what it meant for politics, law, and culture. Some pundits dismissed it as viral theater. But others saw something deeper, a symbolic torch passing from voices of privilege to voices of perseverance. And ordinary Americans, they claimed Crockett as their own. Tweets poured in from teachers, nurses, single parents, and students. "I've been told I was unfit too. Today I felt seen." One viral Facebook post read, "She didn't just clap back at Dershowitz. She clapped back for all of us who were told we didn't belong." It was more than a trending topic. It was resonance. Her words tapped into a collective memory, the times people were silenced, underestimated, dismissed. In Crockett, they saw a champion who transformed insult into fuel, arrogance into accountability. The clip reached tens of millions within days. Commentators called it the mic drop heard around the nation. And as the days passed, the narrative hardened. Crockett had emerged not only victorious in that room, but elevated into a new national spotlight. Dershowitz, once untouchable, now carried the stigma of being bested by the very person he dismissed. Yet, beneath the viral storm, beneath the hashtags, the memes, the applause, something deeper was forming. This wasn't just entertainment. It wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a question of what kind of voices America wanted to elevate in its future. And that deeper message was beginning to take root. When the echoes of Crockett's words finally faded, the chamber seemed forever changed. What at first appeared to be a clash of personalities was revealed, in truth, as a battle of principles. Crockett's rebuttal wasn't merely clever, or sharp, or entertaining. It was a declaration, a statement that credibility is not defined by the titles you hold, the degrees you flaunt, or the years you claim as authority. Credibility, she showed, comes from dignity, service, and integrity. Alan Dershowitz leaned on his reputation, his pedigree, the weight of an old order, where voices like his could dismiss others without consequence. But Crockett stood on something firmer, the lived reality of struggle, the resilience of being underestimated, the power of showing up for people who often have no champion. In that balance, the outcome was inevitable. One man's arrogance versus one woman's dignity. And dignity outlasts arrogance every single time. Her words rose above the insult. They cut through elitism and settled into something universal. "The future doesn't belong to the gatekeepers," she said. "It belongs to the builders." That sentence wasn't crafted for Dershowitz alone. It wasn't a personal jab. It was a truth big enough to carry every American who has ever been told they don't belong. The student was dismissed for their accent. The worker was overlooked. Because of their background, the woman said that the table wasn't hers to sit at. A young person said that their dream was unrealistic. Crockett's rebuttal was for them, for all of us. And in that moment, it became clear. Service is greater than status. Status demands recognition. It leans on hierarchy. It insists on reminding others of its importance. But service doesn't need to shout. It earns its authority by lifting others, by persisting in the face of dismissal. by turning every slight into an opportunity to build something stronger. Crockett didn't claim power. She embodied it. The lesson was unmistakable. Arrogance is temporary. It burns hot, loud, and fast. But dignity, quiet, steady, and resilient, endures. Dershowitz's words might be remembered for their arrogance, but Crockett's will echo for their clarity. He represented the fading roar of entitlement. She represented the rising voice of integrity, and this is why people across the country felt goosebumps. It wasn't about who won an argument. It wasn't about who landed the sharper blow. It was about something deeper, about witnessing a moment when history's weight shifted, however slightly, toward justice. Millions sensed it. Whether they admitted it or not, they were seeing a snapshot of a cultural handoff, the old guard giving way to the new. Not by concession, but by inevitability. This is what made it more than political theater. Theater entertains. This inspired. Theater ends when the curtain falls. This moment was only beginning to ripple outward. Crockett's rebuttal would live in classrooms, in articles, in conversations among families and coworkers. It would live. Wherever people ask themselves, what matters more, the resume you hold or the truth you carry? Her words carved into memory the truth that no insult, no dismissal, no arrogance can silence someone who knows their worth. And in that recognition, Americans found more than applause, they found affirmation. Affirmation that the future isn't written by those who guard doors, but by those who dare to walk through them anyway. And so, when the dust settled, the lesson lingered. Arrogance fades, but dignity stands. Titles can crumble, but truth builds. Its status can be mocked, but service will always be honored. Crockett's clapback wasn't just a moment of defiance. It was a reminder of who we are and who we can be. And that's why this moment is more than just political theater. It's history. Dershowitz tried to tear her down. He leaned on arrogance, titles, and the weight of an old system that too often silenced voices like hers. But Jasmine Crockett's clapback didn't just defend her. It made history. Dignity, and with truth, she flipped an insult into an unforgettable stand. This wasn't just courtroom drama or political theater. It was bigger than that. It was about what it means to be American, to rise when underestimated, to fight when dismissed, and to hold on to dignity when arrogance tries to erase it. Crockett showed that true strength doesn't come from status or reputation. It comes from resilience, service, and the courage to speak for those who can't always speak for themselves. Her response reminds us that every generation faces a choice: bow to entitlement or rise with integrity. Room in that moment. America witnessed the power of rising. That's why this story matters, not just for today, but for the future. Because every time arrogance tries to define credibility, dignity will always rise to redefine it. And Jasmine Crockett's clapback is living proof. Now the question is, will this moment fade into the noise, or will it fuel something greater? That part is up to us. If you believe in voices like Crockett's rising above arrogance, hit subscribe. Share this moment and be part of the movement that refuses to stay silent. Because in the end, it's not about who speaks the loudest. It's about who speaks with truth. And as Crockett proved, truth, carried with dignity, always echoes the longest.